was a top secret special access program proposal within the Department of Homeland Security in 2011. This proposal was ultimately rejected, and these documents were just recently released a couple days ago by AARO, the Department of Defense's office that is tasked with officially investigating the UFO issue. What do these documents tell us? In this video, we're going to do a deep dive, full breakdown. I read all 56 pages of the documents and took out what I found to be the most significant. So in this video, we're going to go a little deeper. We're going to read between the lines and see what can we really get out of this information. So it's going to give us more than just the few minutes that News Nation or some other of the scarce media outlets that will cover this, basically giving the basics. What other details are in here that help us understand the bigger picture of what's going on? And ultimately, these documents, I conclude, support the argument that there are materials, UFO recovery materials and so forth, that are embedded in other programs and special access programs within the government, military, private industry complex. So let's get into it. What is this and why did it happen? We'll start there. So this is what's called a prospective special access program. It's a proposal to have a special access program, which is like a top secret, super exclusive program that only people with a need to know are read into. And these documents were just released a couple days ago, although they were declassified a couple months ago, February 5th of 2024. And this was in a response to AARO had discovered these in the DHS archives and asked for their release. And this was being framed as an advanced technology threat. We'll get into that in a second. And this was pushed by Congress, which we're also going to get into. So the introductory pages of this document gives us a project description. Quote, investigate, identify, and analyze advanced materials and technologies to increase basic knowledge of emerging technical data, to identify and anticipate threats to the U.S. homeland. And it's described as a unified approach to, quote, advanced technological acquisition and consciousness studies. And in the last point, they say, quote, all deliverables are dependent on the initial analysis and assessment of associated existing and discovered information and materials. Now, we're going to see here. And one of the big takeaways from this is what I get from reading this whole thing and the full context is that they really were trying to set up this program to get access to recovery materials that one way or another they had realized exist. And so we're going to see that. We got to keep that in mind. Now they talk about how there would be 4 different research centers. There'd be a data collection and analysis center, advanced technology center, consciousness center, and a technology application center. The details of all of those, which we're going to get into. They say that all these centers will, quote, investigate and inventory available information and materials, advanced materials and controls, alternative energy generation, temporal translation, bending time, space-time is what that implies, human effects and interface, and signature reduction, aka cloaking technology. And in these introductory pages, they state the anticipated results and the value of the research. They say, quote, it's pivotal to identifying the source and substance of associated material and assessments of previous investigatory USG programs, U.S. government programs. What they're referring to there is AAWSAP, also known as AATIP, 2008 to 2010 program that Dr. James Lacatski was the director of and wrote 2 books about. And what they discovered there, they wanted this program to follow that up. They wanted Kona Blue to be, and they're saying it's pivotal, it's crucial, very important to identify where are all these anomalies coming from? What's the substance of them? What's the material? Because they had found out that this material has been recovered, according to them, and is located in classified special access program areas. Now, in the second point, they say, quote, "The success of this research is predicated on the scientific investigation and assessments of available material." Again, started reading this document, that's what really jumped out to me. They're really stressing that they need to get this material that already exists. And in the last point, they say, quote, "The potential exists to increase moral, psychosocial, social cohesion of national power." I just found that as an interesting side note. What that exactly means is up for interpretation. They talk about what's the history of this project. And of course, Kona Blue was supposed to be the ongoing program of what we've come to know as AAWSAP and what also has been called AATIP. Apparently, this is all confusing too, by the way, but AATIP was like the unclassified name for AAWSAP, which was classified. And then when James Lacatski, who's up there in the upper left, was the director from 2008 to 2010. And it was Senators Reid and Senator Inouye. Reid is in the bottom right and Inouye is in the top right, who had pushed and supported and endorsed this program and got it funded. And of course, those are the two books that have told us what happened through Dr. James Lacatski, the director's experience. We have Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, and then the other book that came out just about probably 8 or 9 months ago, the blue one there, Inside the U.S. Government Covert UFO Program. And that's where James Lacatski says, it's only one sentence, and people talk about this and kind of misquote it a little bit, but you can go read it for yourself. It's in chapter 9 of that book, where he does say that they had access to a UFO somewhere. And that was kind of the big bomb from that book. So anyway, this is where it originated from. And before we move on from this, I think it's significant to recognize who Senator Reid and Inouye were. I mean, Senator Reid was the Speaker of the Senate, which is the highest ranking position representing the Senate. Very senior level position, very highly credible, respected individual. You do not just become the majority speaker. So it's not like he's just some kooky senator who was able to slide this project by, even though people will try to paint it as that, like Sean Kirkpatrick seems to be in the interview he gave about Kona Blue. And then in the top right, Senator Inouye. This is someone who had a track record of calling out government agencies who were hiding things and exposed them. He led Senate investigations on the Iran-Contra scandal, and he also led Senate investigations on Project MKUltra. That was when the CIA got caught doing mind control experiments on unknowing citizens. So Inouye has a track record as being, of the utmost integrity and credibility, and he was interested in exposing secrets and cover-ups and corruption. So these are the guys that finally forced in 2008 a funded program to study what's going on with the UFOs and the aliens and all this talk, at least within the Congress and the official Department of Defense channels. And after that 2-year study, this is also an important detail to keep in mind. After AAWSAP ended in December 2010, the research data was put into contractor-secured storage. So that information is still not available to the public. All we've gotten are the books from James Lacatski and whatever documents were declassified from that. So AAWSAP ended in 2010, and it was Senator Reid who continued the charge here. He was pushing for a special access program status to, quote, enable access to data and material held by other government and industry entities. Again, when AAWSAP ended, the their logical next step was, okay, we need access to these materials that exist, that we've been informed exist. And so when you look actually at the end of these Kona Blue documents, you see the back and forth between Senator Reid, and you see the response from the Department of Defense, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and what happened there, which actually differs from what Sean Kirkpatrick says in a recent interview about Kona Blue. But that's another story. Essentially, Senator Reid wrote to the Department of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, if I recall correctly, and said, we would like to continue this program. We'd like it to be a special access program. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense then sent his request to the DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is like the Department of Defense's CIA. And they reviewed the program. And their recommendations were, we don't find that this program is suitable for the DIA's goals, but we will refer it to somewhere else. And basically, that's where what we're going to call the DHS here, the Department of Homeland Security, Senator Reid and Senator Lieberman go to the Department of Homeland Security to try to get the program approved and funded through that channel, since the DIA and the DOD were not going to have it. And we can infer or speculate on why they wouldn't want it, okay, for obvious reasons. So the documents then start to get into what the specifics of what each research center will do. And the National Institute for Discovery Center would collect and deliver reports of sightings, would have evidence collection, laboratory analysis on advanced technology within the U.S. and the neighboring oceans. Also, direct quote from the document, quote, the experimental division will consist of a well-studied experimental location that has been researched for approximately 15 years, Skinwalker Ranch, which is verified later in the document, but as I was reading this, figure that's probably Skinwalker Ranch. And in the last point, quote, focus remote sensing capabilities on all known hotspots, locations with repeated and frequent reports of activity. So they want to monitor these areas where there was a lot of activity. There would have been a medical division where deaths and injuries as a result of interaction with the advanced aerospace vehicles. So at this time in 2011, they were calling them AAVs, what we now call UAPs, which are what are UFOs. So advanced aerial vehicles, AAV, that's what we're going to see in here. They're going to study and treat medical injuries as a result of other anomalies and collateral injuries, physiological effects to family members, which is kind of interesting, gets into the stranger areas of this. The Data Analysis Division would look at the technical design and prototyping of AAV performance and advanced studies of, quote, multi-physics problems. So infer what you will there. How do UFOs work? What's going on? How can we make our own? The Advanced Technology Center would be the center to, quote, access recovered advanced technology and, quote, collect oral histories from retired military, intelligence, and contractor personnel to assist in locating additional recovered advanced technology. So this, for me, it was a real crux of this program proposal for obvious reasons. And then there's the Consciousness Center, which is very interesting. And their purpose would be, quote, to determine the activity and purpose of the advanced technology via remote sensing, which we come to conclude that they're referring to remote viewing here, it seems. And, quote, remote sensing and related techniques may present an invaluable aid in countering illicit activities against the U.S. So obviously the Consciousness Center would have been pretty focused on remote viewing and other abilities to gather intelligence and to basically study and make conclusions about UFOs, UAPs, AAVs, as they call them here, and what's the purpose and activity of what's going on with them, which is a huge question. Been seeing these things for 80 years constantly. What's actually going on? They give some charts here of how it would work. take a look here, you would have the Department of Homeland Security at the top and then a company underneath it, which would branch off into the different divisions. There'd be a second company, and then that would be overseeing the different centers. And again, other charts of how this all would work. So they have it all figured out there. As you read through, they start to dive more deeply into the specific details of what each of these research centers and divisions within them would do. So at the Data Collection and Analysis Center, they would develop an internet site, quote, for advanced aerospace vehicle reporting, basically a massive database that would be updated and all reports could be entered in there that would, quote, expand existing data warehouse that had over 200,000 reports. 200,000 reports that were worthwhile going into this funded Defense Intelligence Agency program. And, quote, to deploy in-house investigators in cooperation with state, local, tribal police, and FBI. So they would have had investigators cooperating with these different law enforcement agencies to go document these different sightings and encounters and collate it all into this one place. Smart, it's a logical way to approach this. And also on the Data Collection Center, they say there are 11 separate databases with over 200,000 UFO reports, the vast majority being after 1947. And they identify specific criteria that they would want the eyewitness investigations to have to meet before they would be entered into the database. And that would be more than one witness. The sighting would have to be less than 600 feet away. There would have to be physical evidence and traces of the sighting. There have to be electromagnetic effects and physiological pathological effects. So they're setting clear standards for what would be reported into this system. And again, another point is that they would obtain all recorded data of UAP from the armed services. So that's obviously Air Force, Navy, Army, etc., NASA, NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, NGIA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Side note, those are the two agencies that David Grusch worked for. NORAD and the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. So they are basically saying, not only are we going to gather our own and add to our already 200,000 reports that we have in the system, we're also going to get turned over to us everything that NASA, all these places have. And that would have been pretty epic because we know that they have tons of data, gun camera footage, satellite imagery, tons of stuff. We could only imagine what kind of UFO recordings they have. They would have a medical center, and some of the quotes from this, they say, quote, to date, some evidence points to non-ionizing EM radiation-associated injury with exposure to the UAPs. We've heard about that, so they'd be looking at that and trying to understand that and protect people from that. And also, in the second point, quote, to create the internal infrastructure, organization, and personnel, as well as contract experts to handle, examine, and research unusual and unique biological specimens at the anatomic, physiological, biochemical, and genetic levels, aka study alien bodies. Now, they slid that in there. In this 56-page report, there's literally only 2 mentions of biological specimens. Not using the term non-human intelligence or non-human biologics. They're just saying unique biological specimens. So that would have been set up as well. We get into the Advanced Technology Center, right, where it gets pretty interesting. The purpose of the Advanced Technology Center would be, quote, to analyze recovered technology, again, recovered technology, in collaboration with major aerospace and electronics companies. Wishful thinking there. Quote, set up protocols for obtaining access to materials, again, and, quote, collect retirees' oral histories on recovered technology and present location. So we see clearly their focus was we want to get access to these materials that all these high-level people are telling us exist. Gain access to all existing caches of advanced aerospace vehicle materials and documentation, whether residing in archive storage or under active program investigation in national laboratories, government organizations, and/or contractors. Again, as we're reading this, we have to assume they must have pretty good reason to be writing this into these documents and asking for millions of dollars through official channels to say that these materials exist somewhere. They say, quote, a program will be established to harness the talents of specialists, especially military personnel and contractors, who are presently or retirees previously involved in AAV evaluation programs, aka people who are involved or used to be involved with UFO reverse engineering, crash retrieval, or whatever you want to imagine has been going on. And they would, quote, take an inventory of AAV hardware and establish that. And they would have this, quote, oral history initiative. And, again, my observation here is they keep emphasizing that it's almost like assumed to be known that this has been being studied and dealt with. Materials have been being recovered and studied in other programs previously. And here they say it in no unclear terms. They say it right here. Quote, over past decades, a number of high-level individuals in the military, intelligence, and even political sectors of our government have had various levels of exposure and access to this subject area. This has included agency directors, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, very senior individuals in the executive branch, certain foreign heads of state, and members of the government contractor community in the electronics and aerospace sectors. So this is what David Grusch is saying. This is what other whistleblowers are saying. I guess what's kind of interesting and novel there is that they're stating that certain foreign heads of state have been read into these programs. That's not something that we necessarily think of so much, so that's interesting. They say, quote, the oral history project will include gathering all information pertaining to the location, and the location was italicized for emphasis in the document. So their emphasis pertaining to the location of the advanced aerospace technology and biological samples. And that was the first time they mentioned biological samples. It was 25 pages into the report. So again, in other words, they are really focusing on finding the location of crash retrieval materials and biological materials. And this would include records, files, reports, photographs, as well as physical evidence. So there it is, right? Now they go on to talk about these experimental centers. They say that they would determine locations where anomalous activity occurs on a regular basis, and they would select at least 2 locations to set up intense sensors and human observations. Moving on to the Consciousness Center. The details of what would be carried out here would be to, quote, expand on remote viewing. We can observe the language there. Expand on remote viewing, not study and figure out if remote viewing works. It's expand on it. So it's already established and being used in a scientific way, apparently. And remote communication, to communicate, right? What do they mean by that? My last video I just did was on a book written in 1997 by someone named Dan Sherman, who claims he was within a program in the U.S. Air Force, within the NSA, National Security Agency, in which he was actually communicating with non-human intelligence as part of a program they were running. Is that what we're talking about here? And the purpose of these remote viewing and communications would be to retrieve data and to transport across dimensional space-time barrier. Infer what we will from that. To, quote, develop remote viewing countermeasures. And, quote, to study consciousness interactions with and control of technology. So, in summary here, they're talking about being able to perceive things across a dimensional space-time barrier, which we could imagine maybe we can do that with our consciousness. Remote viewing countermeasures, meaning, people say there's like consciousness wars, and even though you can remote view certain bases or locations, if they're advanced enough, they have countermeasures so that what you're remote viewing may be inaccurate because of their own whatever psychic programs that are sort of creating a security layer. We could almost imagine like how internet firewalls and data security and all that being done on a psychic level. We could imagine that. And in the last point, study consciousness interactions and control of technology. This has been being said since Philip Corso, well, before, but as late as Philip Corso in 1997, writing his book The Day After Roswell, where he said that they determined that that's how the non-human intelligence, the aliens, were controlling the ship. It was through consciousness. And it's very believable in a sense when we think about, imagine we survived thousands of more years, millions of more years. Of course we'd want to be able to fly a plane or a craft just thinking, all right, go left, go up, go down, accelerate, stop. Of course, it'd be instantaneous. Who wants to push a bunch of levers and buttons and stuff? So it's a logical outgrowth of how advanced a civilization like ourselves even could become. Once we learn how to track thought waves and this and that, I mean, there is an electrical signature to me saying and thinking, go left, stop, accelerate. Once that can be tracked, of course, we can imagine that a ship could be flown like that. So it sounds like science fiction, but if we're dealing with civilizations and intelligences that have had much longer, thousands, millions more years to evolve and expand their technology, well, this becomes actually much less far-fetched sounding. And more on the Consciousness Center, they say, quote, the Consciousness Center manages the acquisition, training, and utilization of remote viewers and communicators. So they'd be training and acquiring people who are able to do this, teaching people to do this. And they say these unorthodox techniques may prove to be critical collection methods. Interesting. And they wanted to, quote, extend remote viewing, remote communication programs. So again, that implies that there already were remote communication programs. And to communicate and retrieve data across dimensional space-time barriers. So that's self-explanatory there as well. And lastly, quote, to conduct experiments to determine the baseline parameters for physical transport across dimensional space-time barrier, as opposed to communication and data transfer only. So in other words, rather than just figuring out how we can communicate and transfer data across dimensional or space-time barriers, start to understand how physical objects could go. So we're talking, portals, jump gates, whatever you want to call it. And that was all certainly talked about in the book that James Lacatski wrote about what they studied in the AAWSAP program, which I have other videos on from last year. There would have actually also been an education center, which is kind of cool. They would have had a volunteer corps of citizens that could become volunteers whose expenses would be reimbursed to support data collection efforts. And also the Education Center would maintain, quote, the world's largest library on AAVs, UFOs, UAPs, whatever you want to call it. And these volunteer corps would have been reimbursed for gas, plane tickets, hotels, car rentals, food, etc. They would have had over 100 volunteers. And I mean, it's kind of cool to think about. Imagine a government-funded citizen UFO researchers. I mean, we spend so much money on so many other things. Would be kind of cool if our tax money could spend for us to have UFO researchers. And they would have trained these researchers to educate their communities at local libraries and colleges as well. So pretty cool ideas. So those are all the details in a nutshell. The highlights from them. And the report goes on now to explain the justification for why this program is needed, why it should be run under the Department of Homeland Security, and why it has to be a special access program. And they say, quote, remote vision, communication, and de-rematerialization techniques to observe, communicate, retrieve data, and transfer matter across dimensional and space-time barriers. Again, let's pause for a second. I don't think that these people would be, these scientists and high-level government officials involved with this would be putting this kind of language in there if they didn't have good data and reasons to assume that this kind of stuff is possible or even exists. Anyway, will undoubtedly be of utmost interest, if not a top priority, for adversarial intelligence services. In other words, they're trying to say figuring out how this stuff works and being able to understand it and do it ourselves and keep it secret would be very important for gathering intelligence and keeping our own security up to date. And here's where a couple bombs are dropped in their justification for the need section. They say, quote, recovered AAV technology exists in and is accessible only within a special access program construct. So these scientists, these people behind proposing this program, are saying that the technology exists but is only accessible within these special access programs. They found it out one way or another, apparently. And they say, quote, retrieval and integration of historical data from high-value personnel with knowledge of recovered AAV technology and present location of recovered material is accessible only within a special access program construct. Again, what is David Grusch saying under oath to Congress? That he gave all the evidence over to the Inspector General, and apparently that's one of the few people in offices who have even get to see this information still to date of the exact locations, the exact people, the exact program names. David Grusch has still not been able to tell this to Congress because he hasn't been able to get his security clearances back. It's obviously a whole thing going on here. If it was as simple as nothing to see here, you're all crazy and making up this wild science fiction UFO alien stuff, then just give David Grusch a security clearance and say, go ahead, talk to Congress in a skiff. The fact that they're not doing that is clear that there's something here. The fact that they gutted the UAP disclosure bill off of everything saying you have to turn over this technology. If they didn't have it, they wouldn't have taken that part out. What would be the reason? So this just gives further support to the idea that there's a very clear reality to this, the David Grusch claims and all the other claims and this whole story. They also say, quote, without protection, the cost associated with a compromise of specific features of this program, especially remote viewing and recovered technology, would result in grave consequences, perhaps irreversible, to the security of the United States. That's interesting. In other words, they're saying that our knowledge and ability with remote viewing and the kind of technology we've been able to recover and figure out is super sensitive. And if that were to get out, there would be grave consequences that are perhaps irreversible. So again, they're trying to justify why they need special access program approval and not just, a lower classification program. And then the document moves on. Here I'm going to point out a couple sections that are redacted. And that means when it's totally blacked out. There was a section of the document where they had a bunch of questions that they showed what the question was and then they gave their answer. And this was the only question totally blacked out. I find it interesting. What would be sensitive or fall under certain redaction qualifications that they needed to black this out? It's pretty interesting. What could it be? They also talk about the specific building that they would have had the Kona Blue program at in Las Vegas, Nevada. They talk about how big it is and everything. They black out who the building's owned by. And then down there, they actually talk about the 80-acre research property in Utah that's owned by, blacked out. Obviously, that's Bigelow at the time. And this is obviously Skinwalker Ranch. That was under 24/7 armed guard. Skinwalker Ranch, a whole other story, but interesting to see it there. There was a meeting about this program, and all of the people attending were blacked out. And then on the bottom there's a whole nother section fully blacked out. It's kind of like Interesting. Why? And why can't we know who was there? If we could see who was there, we could start to reach out maybe to people for comment. What did you think of this program? What happened? Get the story, but that's all blacked out. And now we get into the last part, which is basically equally as interesting and important as all the details we just went over of what the program was going to do and the language and the claims that were being made in the program proposal. Now we're going to look at what happened, why did it get turned down, and what were the reactions of the people within the Department of Homeland Security who were considering approving this program. So initially, somebody named Joel Wall, who I've never heard of, but he was a director of the Special Projects Office in Homeland Security. And he was supportive of this program. The first line in the chain of command that this proposal had to get cleared through was through someone named Dr. Tara O'Toole. And she was the Undersecretary for Science and Technology at the Department of Homeland Security. So let's take note of that. That's a very high-level position in a very important department in our government. Department of Homeland Security, Undersecretary for Science and Technology. You have to be very highly qualified, intelligent, and a serious person to be in that position. So she got this whole program, talked to everyone involved, got all the information and the science behind it all, and she approved it. So then next, it would go to the next level up where it would need that final approval before it could become and be funded as a special access program, and that would be to the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, we see in here some of the direct quotes about what Dr. Tara O'Toole said. There was a November 21st, 2011 meeting about this program and whether or not it should be approved. It said in these meeting notes, it says, quote, the entire meeting was devoted to the discussion of the Kona Blue program. And it says, quote, Dr. O'Toole proceeded to discuss what she knew of the history of the Kona Blue program while it was being conducted at DIA and discussed the technology as she knew it. So that's talking about the AAWSAP, aka AATIP program. So in this meeting, Dr. O'Toole talked about what she knew about it and also the technology as she knew it. So what does that mean? What was she briefed on? What was she shown that convinced her? More redactions from this meeting. The whole statement of the General Counsel about the rationale for making this a special access program, which would be pretty important to us understanding, like, why was this program shot down? It's totally blacked out. So make of that what you will. And here's a little bomb from Dr. O'Toole from the meeting notes. It says, quote, Dr. O'Toole explained that there is very serious science involved with this program and that she felt the U.S. government had the responsibility to continue its investigation. So we have to take a step back and acknowledge here, very high level, very highly credentialed, credible, qualified person in a very important, high-level, serious position. She's being presented with something like this about let's call it what it is: UFOs and aliens and time travel and dimensional transport and all of this. And she was willing to stick her neck out and say this is very serious science, and that the U.S. government had a responsibility to keep investigating it. So make of it what you will. I personally don't think she would risk her reputation putting her name to something like this if she wasn't convinced for some reason that it was legit. And then it goes on to say a discussion about whether the DIA no longer had the authority to conduct data collection for Kona Blue took place. Those are just kind of some details about if the DIA would still be involved with Kona Blue or not. And in some final notes here, during this whole attempt to get it approved, it said, quote, material has been acquired through various sources since the DIA program ended in December 2010. So that's kind of interesting. After AAWSAP ended, more material was acquired, apparently. And it says, for example, ongoing observations and recordings of anomalies observed at sites at the Bigelow Ranch in Utah. There's our confirmation that they've been talking about Skinwalker Ranch. They named 2 others that I personally haven't come across. You may have the San Juan Valley in Colorado and Marley's Woods in Missouri. That's pretty interesting. I don't know anything about those places. I may have heard of them before, but I don't know. And it says, quote, once again, additional classified material is believed to exist within other governmental special access program and will be accessed for this effort. Again, one of the big reasons for them trying to justify why they need special access program status is so that they can access these materials that exist in other special access programs. So after this meeting, after all this documentation, Dr. Tara O'Toole sends a letter to the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security and recommends that they approve this program. And she says, quote, based upon discovery and investigative discussions, interviews, and briefings with former AATIP program participants, the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology proposes to provide special access program support. An SAP is proposed as we have been informed that there is a body of previous work held by other entities that requires a SAP level classification to access it. So whatever they present to her to convince her that there was other reverse engineering, recovered technology, whatever it is, in other departments and entities, she was convinced. Otherwise, I don't think she would have wrote this letter to the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security trying to justify why she should approve the program. So this makes it all the way over to the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Jane Hall Lute, and she just shoots down the program and terminates all hopes of Kona Blue. And in the documentation it says, quote, Deputy Secretary Lute directed that the proposed special access program be terminated immediately after a meeting discussing if there was a rationale for the SAP. So there's some brief meeting notes basically saying they debated and discussed if there was enough reason for it to be justified as a special access program. And Deputy Secretary Lute had the sole power to approve or disapprove this. And as a side note, not to get sidetracked here, but I find it interesting how something like this, using money to study something that clearly exists and is a mystery, at least officially, ends up falling into the power of one unelected person, this Deputy Secretary of a Department of Homeland Security. I mean, it's just crazy. Like, that it falls in this one person's decision. And she just says no. I think we need new systems in place. That should be voted on, something like this, at the very least. Anyway, to the third bullet point, she said the program, quote, did not require extraordinary security measures and was closed down. And in my notes underneath that, I find that to be this interesting dynamic. After you sit down and read this whole 56-page document, you can kind of read between lines and see what was really going on here. It seems like Senator Harry Reid and the AAWSAP people and everyone else who had an interest in that were trying to get this special access program, among other things, but it seems mainly to get access to these materials that they were convinced existed. And so they tried to get it through Department of Homeland Security, which I think was a strong enough argument. We need to study this stuff and figure it out so that we can protect our country from this technology being used against us. We have to understand it first, right? Seems clear enough to me. But they couldn't get that justification. They couldn't convince the powers that be that there was justification to give them a special access program, that they themselves needed that special access program classification. They couldn't get it by Deputy Secretary Lute here. And just kind of having a little fun here, what it breaks down to, really, after all this, is it in these two people in the chain of command. Should we study recovered UFOs? Undersecretary of Science and Technology O'Toole on the left there, yes, of course, why not? And Deputy Secretary Lute, saying, get out of here, no. And who knows why she turned it down. She might have just thought it was nonsense. She might just be one of those people who is a skeptic, is a debunker, and thinks it's all ridiculous. She might have been, told that that's what she had to do. She might have legitimately not be convinced that it needed special access programs. She might literally be part of a cover-up. Who knows? But she turned it down. An unelected person. And that's the story. That's the story of Kona Blue, guys. That is really, the deep dive on it. So before we close it out here, let's just make some takeaways and conclusions. The first bullet point. What other programs and materials were known by AAWSAP, aka AATIP, to exist? It's very clear that they were referring to them. Multiple programs over decades. And we've heard of them from other whistleblowers, and I've never gotten official verification of them, but of course we continue to ponder what's going on there. The language in this document, I think, is what really says a lot. Again, just zooming out and saying, okay, they were talking about these things. It was approved by very high-level people initially. These were serious scientists putting forth these notions. Wasn't just some crazy science fiction nonsense. And the support of Dr. O'Toole is significant. That's one of the biggest takeaways from this. And I give credit to the News Nation reporter who's been covering this in Washington on the Hill, Joe Khalil, because he highlighted this. And some of News Nation kind of like goes back and forth and toes the line. Sometimes they sound like they're debunking and being skeptical, but sometimes they sound like they're holding the government and the DOD's feet to the fire with this whole thing. But Khalil, pointed that out in the little 2-3 minute segment on News Nation. Dr. O'Toole approved this, okay? Now, going deeper into this, really zooming out and saying what's really going on here with the whole disclosure narrative, the whole game here, potential chess game being played behind the scenes. Why did AARO release this? Well, it seems from Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick's interview that perhaps they hoped to release this to prove that nothing was going on. They may be hoping that this proves, hey, there were some people that wanted us to take this seriously, but there was nothing there to study, so they shut it down. But it's not that simple, obviously, for many reasons. Is this part of a limited hangout agenda, right? Is this a way to release this to the public and say, hey, look, these things were being talked about. There were claims that this existed in places, and Kona Blue frames it as like, we don't know anything about this. We need to start studying this. So if they want the disclosure to be, okay, guys, yeah, there's some things that have crashed, materials that have been recovered, even some bodies, but we have no idea what it is. We don't know how to communicate with them. We don't know how the technology works. That could very much, I think that's very plausible that that's the kind of disclosure that they're going to want to roll out, at least initially. And that would suck, I think, because I think it's much deeper than that, personally. And this release of Kona Blue would support that. It would almost break in the people, the small percentage of people who are even interested in this whole topic, first of all. But it would sort of break in the paper trail of like, okay, there were some serious people who thought this was real and wanted to study it. And okay, yeah, Kona Blue wasn't approved, but there was another program that was approved. And yes, guys, there is some material, but we can't talk about it because of national security reasons, and we're very limited in how far we've gotten with it. So I could see it as that as well. Hopefully we get strong, what our whole real disclosure, or at least a more truthful disclosure, I think is going to hinge on is getting these real firsthand witnesses with hard evidence to come out in hearings and tell the Congress and tell the people and tell the world what they've seen, what they know. And that's going to force the hand here. But who knows how this is going to play out. In the last bullet point, reading between the lines on this whole thing, we can conclude, and I make this conclusion, that overall these Kona Blue documents support the argument that UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs exist. Why do I say that? Because everyone who put together that report was saying it. Lacatski in his book about AAWSAP, said that they had access to at least one vehicle. Dr. Tara O'Toole, Undersecretary of Science and Technology for the Department of Homeland Security, was convinced and said this was very serious science and the U.S. government had a responsibility to keep studying this. So I think these documents overall, they support this claim. They support it. And that there's entities within the U.S. government and contractors that have this material and have this knowledge of UFOs and aliens. So I think on the whole, even though the media and AARO and whoever else can slant this and dress it up as, hey, people came in and said Kona Blue was hiding everything, and look, here it is. It was just a proposed program that never even got approved, and it was shot down because there was no evidence. They're already starting to frame it like that. But when we look at it for ourselves, we see that people were taking this very seriously. And I think that actually supports the argument for a UFO alien reality of a decades-long cover-up and further knowledge that has been kept from us, the general public, for many years. So it was interesting to dive into this, and we'll see where this goes next. I do actually think on the whole this is a positive development, or at least just neutral. But there's the potential for them to spin this into, hey, nothing to see here. But I don't think they're going to succeed there. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.